So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining from. You're all warmly welcome to this Map the Change session titled, How Can We Transform Leadership and Governance in INGOs? My name is Charles Kojo Van Dyke, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. What we'll try to do with this session is to explore the current models of leadership and governance within INGOs, identify new practices that could help reimagine ways of working that could create transformative leadership and governance. We also hope that this session will provide an opportunity for the speakers and all of us in this room to share experiences of leadership and governance practices that are quite essential for shifting power to local communities and southern partners. So today, we have the pleasure of hosting two astute civil society practitioners and leaders, Osai Ojigo and Wolfgang German. Now, I'll introduce Osai. Osai is the country director of Amnesty International in Nigeria. Osai is a human rights expert, gender equality advocate, a lawyer, and a civil society leader with extensive experience working within the African human rights system. She's also worked a lot on gender justice and good governance. Prior to joining Amnesty International, Osai served in various roles with Oxfam, including interim Pan-Africa director of Oxfam's Pan-African program. She's well-traveled and widely published. She was named one of the 100 most influential civil society leaders in Nigeria in 2021. You are warmly welcome, Osai.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Wolfgang German is the executive director at the International Civil Society Center in Berlin. He has been working in the field of development cooperation and humanitarian assistance for most of his professional life. In the past 15 years, in CEO positions at international aid organizations like CARE International, Deutsche Welthunger Hilfe, I hope I pronounced that well, and CARE Deutschland. As a strong supporter of inter-organizational collaborations, he has led strategic partnerships like the Alliance 2015 or United for Africa to promote collective approaches toward large ambitions under the Sustainable Development Goals. You are warmly welcome, Wolfgang.
Thank you, Charles, for the kind introduction, and greetings, everyone.
Thank you so much. So as you can see, today we are in great company. But before we get into the conversation, I'd like us all to share our perspectives on how we can reimagine leadership and governance within INGOs. So I will now kindly ask the tech team to share the Mentimeter link in the chat. And if we can all go to that link, click on the Mentimeter link, and if the tech team can project the question. So here's the question. How can we transform leadership and governance of INGOs? And so there are several answers there that you can select, all the above, or you can select other. How can we transform leadership and governance of INGOs? Thank you for sharing your perspectives. We're getting a lot of all the aboves, which is great. So the choices are increased minority representation at board and leadership level, decentralized decision-making closer to target communities, contextualized partnership policies to shift power to communities, and then all the above and other. Okay, great. So I hope you've all been able to select. Yeah, okay, it's still rising. Excellent. Nice, great. So, I mean, it's good to see the results there. And I think there's a general agreement on some of the things that need to be done. But of course, today we're going to have a conversation to see, apart from the things that we shared on that Mentimeter, what else needs to be done in terms of in practical terms. So we're going to have a conversation with Osai and Wolfgang. So Osai, I'll start with you. And just reflecting on what you've seen on the Mentimeter and your own background working in the INGO sector all these years. Can you share with us some of your leadership experiences in terms of learning and in terms of how leadership has evolved within the INGO sector?
Yeah. Thanks, Charles. Such a very loaded question to kickstart this conversation. It was quite interesting to see the results of the Mentimeter, particularly around the options that were laid. And of course, there's that issue about decentralizing the power, because where power is concentrated, tends to mean that you have to move closer, and then it means you have to move closer to HQ in order to be more influential within the organization and in terms of pushing the issues that are of interest to you. I thought it was interesting that the point around minority representation on board and leadership was not seen as a potential way to challenge the way leadership exists. And it's this tension, I believe, that exists around using quotas, around people being tokenized, so to speak. So even when someone is very qualified, the fact that you are the sole dark-skinned person on the board or the only Global South person on the board could be seen more as a gesture rather than someone being qualified to be there, and which then also perpetuates some of the myths around capacity and around the genuine interest in ensuring that there's equality and access to power available for everyone who is capable and has the capacity to lead. So more directly, in terms of my own experience, it's been a gradual rise, and I've been very grateful that I had people on my journey that are very supportive, both as peers, as mentors, and also surprisingly as sponsors, because in the development sector, a lot of the movement is geared towards moving people to roles where they are like jack of all trades, you know, masters of none, in my view. And so having people who are there to catch you, to support you, has been very instrumental in my journey. I started off with Alliances for Africa in Lagos, Nigeria. And this was an organization, even though located in Lagos, at that time we also had an office in the UK, and most of my work was regional based. And the idea was, how can we get more African CSOs, individuals, activists, and lawyers in particular to begin to engage with the human rights system, the African human rights system. So it was an exciting time because we were moving away to a more regional focused justice delivery rather than national, in the hope that decisions at regional level would then influence national governments to act. Now we know better. We know you cannot dispose of one over the other, but they are complementary. But at that time, we thought, okay, yeah, we're going to get these fantastic decisions. And then the national has no choice but to abide. We never really thought through in terms of the implementation, the fact that it will now require another level of diplomacy, advocacy, and campaigning, because the regional decisions were more like persuasive, since the courts and the commissions couldn't enforce those decisions themselves without the assistance of the countries concerned. But while I was working with Alliances for Africa, I was exposed to also some of the tensions around the competition for proposals for grants from donors. And it shocked me because, you know, when you come in very idealistic with the views that we're all going to be on the same page, we're all fighting for the same things. But I was instantly surprised that I was also in this field competing with other people who didn't mind saying one or two negative reviews about our work in order to have a step ahead. And I did feel that we're all fighting for the attention of the big donors, fighting for attentions of the INGOs as well. And then fast track, a couple of years after, I rose to Deputy Executive Director at Alliances for Africa. So I left after 8 years and joined Oxfam. And I was like, yes, finally, I'm in this big INGO. We're going to make change happen. I'm bringing my local experience, my national and regional diversity. We are going to shake things up. And then I was hit with bureaucracy, first of all. The fact that decision makers at every stage of the value chain, and I was coming from an organization whereby you could just walk to the door of the executive director, get things signed off, you know, brainstorm on ideas. And there were now people sitting in different locations of the world, deciding on a project they didn't design, they're not a part of, and they will not be implementing. So that was another surprise for me. But interestingly, I was also now open to the fact that even though power was concentrated within the INGOs and in HQs, there was a sort of decentralization of knowledge, of resources, of access. Once you're within the INGO, you're able to tap into years of research, campaigning tools. You have resources. I could go to any government department and say, I'm from Oxfam, and everybody's like, oh yes, please have a seat. We want to have a conversation with you. The difference in terms of reception compared to when I was doing the same, I was still walking the same corridors, but now wearing a different hat was also, you know, kind of like a surprise to me as well. But then we're now moving into a time within INGOs that they wanted people that looked more like me to be representative of the organization in the communities we serve. So even though I was Nigerian, working in Kenya, working in Cameroon, working in Ghana, many of the local communities, because I was African, felt that they could also have these conversations with me. But what I didn't realize was that there were other CSO actors who also saw me as a blocker or as a gatekeeper to them accessing the same resources that I felt I was, you know, sharing and willing to, you know, project within the organization. I also found myself as someone who, knowing where they were coming from and being in the system with the processes, tried to shield some of them from some of our bureaucratic processes. I failed woefully in that aspect because I never seemed to win on either side. Within my organization, I was seen as not being firm enough, pushing to make sure people were compliant with the processes. And on the other side, I could also appear like someone who now thought I was better than them because I now sit in some fancy office in Nairobi and I'm calling the shots. But nonetheless, there was a lot of advice from other African leaders within the system, other people of color, but also I had very instrumental bosses and managers who were very much inspired by my work and wanted to support me, and in some cases provided the shield. You know, when the heavy hand comes in terms of not following the processes exactly, provided the defense to ensure that I could do my work and could speak for me in those places. But I also know there were those who didn't have such understanding managers and oftentimes felt that they were struggling and that they were being thrown under the bus because it was always about what the boss wants rather than what was right for the organization or the beneficiaries of the work they were doing. But I also saw that there were some limits to how I could grow if I did not toe a particular line. And I started questioning my identity as someone who had chosen this pathway, whether I was in the right organization. What do I mean? When you say we're in the business of doing good, it means that we've already placed ourselves to act in a particular way, and we put ourselves on a pedestal. And sometimes without realizing it, you're also carrying pride in the way you do things. And you could, without realizing it, be disparaging other people's work because you feel if you were good enough, then you would have gotten the grant or you'll be where I'm sitting. I am here because I'm the best person for the job. But without realizing that it's actually an opportunity to serve. And then within the INGO structure as well, you find the tensions, the fights, the calls for relevance. And it's all about who is more visible in the leadership of certain projects. So the competition now comes internally. I've had to deal with more fights internally within the INGOs I've worked with, whether it's Oxfam or Amnesty International, than in the national organizations that I have worked in. Because there's also that fight that the closer you are to power, the more influential you are. And this can play out in the way they perceive you and in the way they perceive the positions you put on the table. Perhaps to also give the time for Wolfgang to come in as well. I'll end with the point that there are other layers to my leadership journey in terms of people accepting a Black woman, young, in a leadership position, and how this sometimes means that you second guess yourself because there's more interrogation in terms of your decisions. Even when you share information at a level involving peers, I have sometimes come out of some of those conversations asking what happened there. And I recognize that many people are not used to seeing someone like me in a position of authority. They're used to offering help. They're used to giving advice. And now I'm actually taking decisions which they disagree with, but they can do nothing about because I'm the one signing off on that particular document or project. And that is creating a tension in terms of how they accept people that look like me and how we bring our own style to the leadership table. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Osai. That was a very interesting, candid view that you shared there. There's so many issues that you've brought up on your transition from the national organization to INGOs and experiencing the level of bureaucracy, but also the recognition about the privilege and access that you had even when you were engaging with government and other stakeholders. And then, of course, the perception of the gatekeeper issues, the heavy eye on compliance and risk. And then, of course, you know, the fact that you were blessed in a way to have a manager that was empowering, which you talked about. But the thing that struck me most was the power dynamics, the fact that you recognized that you had power and that you had to exercise it responsibly. But in many spaces, you saw that that power was not being exercised responsibly. Then, of course, the competition. I think we're all familiar with the internal competition and wrangling. And then, of course, the fact that you are not exactly the color that is supposed to be making certain decisions. And so there's a certain discomfort that you have some sort of authority. And I thought, I think these are very interesting perspectives that you share. So Wolfgang, do you have a similar story or a different trajectory in terms of your experiences within the INGO when it comes to leadership and how leadership is evolving?
No, thanks a lot. And I'm still contemplating on Osai's amazing insights, really powerful testimonial, and when he was speaking also, I was thinking about my own journey. And of course, I'm coming from a very different angle. I was prepared to speak about the current role, because I do work with leaders in the sector. The International Civil Society Center works with those 20 or so large ICSOs, and I will do that. And I will also talk a little bit about what I'm seeing there. But let me also share at least some personal insights about my journey, which again, is a different one, but a lot resonates with what you've been saying, Osai. And frankly, when I started as a young man entering this profession, these were different times. I started in the early 90s, and I was working over 8 years overseas, so in Africa and in Southeast Asia. And over that entire journey of being an expat and being eventually a leader in NGOs that work internationally, you become part of a journey of the entire sector. Now, I never started as a do-gooder, as a philanthropist or something. We came from an analytical point of view in the 90s when we learned about the global injustice, the things that are wrong in the world. And this is less pity or trying to do good, is more trying to change structures. And that was something that is not new. That is something I think that has characterized the sector for long. And many professionals came into that because we were aware about colonial structures and imperialism and whatnot. Now, of course, when you get into practice, then all of a sudden you're being faced with things that surprise you. And I have to say, particularly the work that I did as an expat, as someone who comes from the global north and works in the global south, kind of makes you feel very quickly out of place. Maybe from a different angle than you say, Osai, but you feel out of place because you're being entrusted a level of power, resources, influence, and visibility that you very often feel you don't deserve. You wonder, why is that? A young man, whatever, not even 30, and all of a sudden you command all these grants and make decisions and the like. And this leads to, at least in my case, a lot of reflection over, okay, how do I deal with these roles responsibly? And I have to say, in the early 90s, it was very relevant for me to be part of an initiative that is called Do No Harm, and it has become a sector trait ever since, but it was really reflecting on what damages does international aid do, particularly in conflict settings. And the Do No Harm became actually a movement. And we worked in South Sudan and Afghanistan and Liberia and the like. And it was really something I think that characterizes also the learnings from the mistakes that were made. And eventually when you reflect enough, and you try to contribute, you move along and assume leadership positions, and then other things happen. So I've seen in these leadership positions, I have to say, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's a lot of stuff that is still going not very well. And I don't want to share too many anecdotes, but what I have to say is also that over those years, or maybe decades, I've seen significant transitions happening in the sector. And that's why even today, I do believe in the value of international NGOs, or international civil society organizations. And I do believe in their ability to adjust and to transform. There's a lot of, I don't want to be overly optimistic, but there's a lot of good stuff that has been happening. The entire sector has moved from needs-based to rights-based. There has been a lot of work around accountability, progressing partnerships, quality standards, and the like. So I think that needs to be acknowledged. But I'm also incredibly grateful for the push that came 3, 4, 5 years ago, particularly through the feminist movements, the decolonizing aid movement, the anti-racist campaigns, which I think really changed the needle, because progress was not fast enough. It was not good enough in terms of decolonizing, how we say now today, right? Decolonizing the sector and the like. So I think the dynamic of the sector has changed, and it has made really progress possible in a faster way. Now, when I speak about the sector, I speak about people. This is not something abstract. These are leaders, and a leader isn't necessarily only a CEO. I mean, we're all leaders in our own rights. We have things to contribute. Very often in the nonprofit sector, there are flat hierarchies. We all have much more decision-making rights than sometimes you work in the corporate sector or elsewhere. So I think leadership also has progressed. I do remember some kind of heroes in the old days, people who kind of rolled up their sleeves out of the way, kind of the traditional stuff we talk about when we say of how things should not be done anymore. But in my observation, and please, correct me if I'm wrong, there's been so much reflection and also accountability going on about good and bad leadership behavior that some of that really toxic stuff has been overcome. Not everything, but I'm relatively optimistic, particularly about the organizations I'm working with right now. And Charles, you have introduced me properly earlier, but the fact that the International Civil Society Center, which is also partnering with RINGO and others, is invited to this, I think, is acknowledging what I'm seeing as the willingness to learn, the interest to transform, the interest to keep up with the challenges that come with these transformations and really live up to the responsibilities that the leaders in the sector have. Now, maybe last point to the poll, coming back, I had a similar observation as Osai. I think all of the above matters, of course, but the first point I found particularly ill-phrased, because minority representation in boards, there's so much wrong about this term. First of all, why minorities? The people that matter in decision-making are majorities, These are people that we work with, local communities, partners, and the like. These are people who are not supposed to be seen as a minority. Secondly, representation is way not good enough. We know boards and leaderships need to be seen differently, need to have different compositions and diversity. I think we all know this, but representation is just a fig leaf. Bringing voices to governance is a good first step. Are these voices being heard? That's a necessary next step. And even if the voices are being heard, do they make a difference in decision-making processes? These are the questions we need to ask, rather than composition has a certain diversity. Anyway, let me rest my case here. I think we have still much more to discuss. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang, for those insights. Some really great food for thought. It was good to know a lot more about you and how you've evolved with the sector itself, and the fact that you were very candid that you're not driven by you called it a do-gooder, but you're looking at how you can actually restructure and look at systems change in that instance. And of course, you're very candid about your expat experience, which was very helpful, about wondering whether you were even in the right place and you are the right person to be making those decisions at that time when you were very young. But one good thing I love is that it's not all doom and gloom to you. There's been significant strides that have been made. You've seen the strides being made within the CSO sector. You said it was driven by some of the movements that we've seen on localization, decolonization, the feminist movements. That's shaping the way we are thinking, the way we are engaging, and the way INGOs are evolving. You did say that toxic behavior is reducing. It'll be good to to see that whether everybody agrees with that. And that there's a certain willingness to transform and learn, which I think is incredible. So Osai, you were part of the social lab, the RINGO social lab, and you participated in the whole process. So from your experience in the social lab, based on what we've discussed so far, how do you see the appetite, some of the things that Wolfgang said, in terms of the willingness to transform and learn? How is that? Do you see that in the social lab, and how do you think, what do you think needs to be done to shape governance and leadership in INGOs moving forward?
Okay, thanks for that question. I think the whole idea of RINGO was really to bring like-minded individuals to test and also to realize that they are not alone. I think there's a tendency for us to feel that we're in these big organizations and we have all the networks and we can move on together. So participating in Ringo and having those conversations enabled a safe space, I believe, to actually reflect without fear of being punished in some shape or form for expressing a dissenting view, or for, you know, just venting in terms of your frustrations with the system. For me, I think what would really be instructive is if we're able to then build this movement within our various structures to have a voice of reason, regardless of where you are located, whether you are the CEO, or whether you are the head of a department, or whether you're a programs manager or coordinator, or even in monitoring and evaluation, to see how we're able to take on those best practices and lessons and the prototypes we've been able to develop in order to effect real change. Because if that doesn't happen, then I think we would all be like very disappointed, very desolate about that. But also more importantly is we are being given a chance to rebuild. Do we have the courage to dismantle? Is where I feel there needs to be more prodding. Everybody says the same thing. Everybody would like things to change, but do we have the courage? Are people in a better placed position to lead that conversation? And this would be, I think, the major obstacle we need to cross, because it's all nice, we're all here having these conversations, but at the back of my mind, I'm like, can I really walk up to the Secretary General and say, well, we now have this conversation on this, but based on what I know now, this isn't going to work. And they've invested money, they've got it signed off by the international board. And you'd be like, who the hell do you think you are, right? So how do we mobilize across our different institutions to bring that those issues to life without it being dismissed and without you exposing yourself to potentially being isolated completely from having any sort of influence in the work you do? And I'm hoping that we can get some tips in terms of how we can have those conversations collaboratively as INGOs, so that we don't expose the individuals who are willing and are placed in our institutions to drive this change. Already, I've benefited from using some of Ringo's materials and resources in some of the conversations we're already having internally. At Amnesty International, for example, we are now having a very active anti-racism process, which of course is requiring each national entity to have an anti-racism national plan, which is feeding into the global plan. But we feel the resistance of people who say, okay, but we don't have these kinds of issues, maybe in some bigger national entities, but not ours. And we're also having the issue of people asking for information. They ask you for information, but you feel that they're not really using it, but rather wanting to tick a box. So when you've now come forward to say, okay, but we're not there yet, and people feel, oh, we've made much progress because we now have our national action plan, we're working with the relevant DEI advisor, we're even working with other global South actors and all of that. You find that we're still very much disconnected in terms of what really anti-racism means, how we make decisions amongst ourselves, how we share power, how we share resources, and how this is also reflecting in the work we do with our partners on the ground. So excellent opportunity for us to rebuild. I think there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of resources, but how we can then harness the collaborations with other entities in order to then fight. And I'm using the word fight very respectfully within our institutions that does not leave us deflated is what I think would be a good, takeout from all these processes at RINGO. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Osai. Thank you for what you're sharing. I think one of the things that struck me about what you said is the question you asked, do we have the courage to dismantle? Dismantling means we've seen opportunity to do something different and to transform. And also the fact that RINGO has presented a lot of opportunities in terms of resources, tools, networks. But how are we going to apply, and what is going to come out of the prototyping? And there's a lot of questions there that we need to reflect on. So Wolfgang, you also served on the advisory board of the RINGO process, and you are involved in it in terms of giving strategic direction and insights. And so based on some of the things that Osai has shared, what are your perspectives on how you think RINGO can do this dismantling, to transform our sector?
Yeah, thanks. It was quite a privilege to serve on that advisory board. Thanks for giving us the opportunity. I think the RINGO process as it was started is very, very unique and very ambitious, and it's truly challenging. I mean, even the title, Reimagine INGOs, it is something, let me put it this way. I found it very, very participatory. We have a lot of diversity of actors from all over the sector, from different regions, from different hierarchy levels involved. So there's a lot of strength in this process. And the prototypes that have been selected, the center itself, I think we're involved in 2 to 3 of those prototypes. They're very ambitious. The risk sharing one that we talked about, I think was it on Monday, untying aid, solidarity term models. These are all very ambitious and concrete prototypes and worth supporting. And they also link up with some of the stuff that the center does, like our own Solidarity Action Network and Power Shift Governance Labs. Now, there is a little downside, I would say, to this, and I think it resonates with some observations by Osai. I think in trying to be very practical and concrete through the prototypes, to a certain extent, the overall idea of reimagining ICSOs, the systems change ambition, the reimagining the sector, might have been watered down a little bit. So once you get more concrete, there's a danger that you lose sight of, okay, something bigger needs to change, and that something bigger should not remain abstract. So what I'm talking about is rethinking particularly the mandates and the roles of INGOs, the business models, the way they work. I haven't found enough of that in the prototypes, I have to say, and particularly when we wanted to engage stronger, I feel we haven't found enough space for those bigger questions to look into. And I'm not criticizing the prototypes. I think they're all very relevant and will make a lot of sense as they continue. Maybe one observation that Osai made about walking up to the Secretary General and saying, hey, there's something here, I think that's another observation. I'm wondering about the level of leadership reach of the RINGO initiative. How many, well, I said everyone is a leader, but how many kind of C-type leaders in the sector have we managed to involve actively? We've also been trying to give a platform a couple of times for Deborah and others to speak to our CEOs, but I think there's more to be done. And I think that deficiency is even more visible when it comes to governance. When we really want to penetrate governance, there's way to go through the experiences from RINGO and making a difference to how those large INGOs are to be changed. Because there's so much to learn for the leaders in the sector from this initiative. So I would hope that we find more opportunity to involve them, to excite them, because I think the intellectual and also the intellectual capacity and the willingness to engage is there, but there's other hurdles we have to overcome, and I'll speak to this maybe a little bit later. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Wolfgang. I think you've raised some really pertinent issues. I think the thing that we need to reflect on to keep the momentum of what Ringo is contributing to is this focus on the systems change, and your caution that we should not get into this projectized kind of mentality, which is going to dilute the whole idea of a systems change, and that we should not be abstract. I think these are very important. You did raise issues that I would love Osai to speak on, because it speaks to what actually needs to be done in the sector differently. So what needs to happen in terms of the issues that need to be addressed in the sector? You mentioned some. You said the roles, business models, and ways of working, which I thought were very important things that you mentioned. And of course, one important thing, which is linked to what Osai said, the leadership reach. How do we get this change to be talked at the board levels, and even beyond the board levels, at the policy levels, national policy levels? So I don't know if, Osai, you have some perspectives on this, focusing on practical terms. What needs to be changed? Is it the roles? Is it the business models? Is it the ways of working? Is it the engagement at the board levels and the policy level? And how do we go about doing this?
Yeah, I think it's important to start this, by saying that it would differ from organization to organization, even though we're all INGOs, because we're all at different levels in terms of our processes and how we're already conceptualizing the issues. But a very good place to start is also ways of working, because when people feel more at ease with one another, they are less threatened. You see people come up to meetings, there's already a worst case scenario, best case scenario, there's a defense stance. Even with virtual meetings, you can already feel some tensions on the screen, you know, in some of these very difficult conversations. So if our ways of working can evolve to not necessarily be the regular, meetings we have, the director meetings, thematic meetings, then we say we're doing consultation with partners, which then tends to mean you talking with partners rather than having partners in the room when you are also debating amongst yourselves. And then also within the different business units, how they relate to finance. Think, okay, we're one team, you guys don't know what you're doing. So there needs to, those structures need to be flexible enough and facilitate access, and also be open to have people who are not normally in those conversations participate in those conversations, because we'll be amazed what we'll hear when we have such, and we encourage people to participate in it. It also means those conversations need to be regular, and not necessarily that it has to fit a particular time frame, but people know that, okay, you can join a morning session and afternoon session. There are going to be speakers leading and facilitating, because we'll need that coordinated. And that at every stage, you're already showing what you've done, whether it's a quarterly basis or monthly basis, in order to move up on the particular issue that is being tackled. I also think that as INGOs, because there are so many things that we're debating at the moment, perhaps is to pick one issue, one or two, and be able to report on that effectively. Let's not wait till the annual report. Then when I say, oh, we had 10,000 reaches of this, we had 5 meetings with so-and-so, we're able to, develop 20 action plans, and we raised this amount of money, and we were able to offer, anti-racism training to 10 of our board members. You get what I mean? It has to be something that we are constantly evaluating as things develop, so that people see that there's a willingness to change, and that the points they've brought on the table have been accepted. we also need to be more flexible to allow us to test certain things, even when we can't see it ourselves, but we have people in the room who are willing to do so. Either it's beneficiaries saying, oh, please, we don't want to be using bank transfers. We want to use mobile banking, for example, and you know you're not going to get receipts for it because they will have to scan. So it means you have to trust them that when they screenshot their phones, you are going to get, you know, the proof that the money actually went. And I think that point about, because we can talk about the work we're doing. There's a phrase we use in Nigeria called political will. I'm sure, Charles, you can also relate to that. We can do that and people will nod in agreement. This is what we need. And in the same nod would say, oh, but this is not our priority right now. So it's good to have, but it's not our priority. And so if there's a way that those who are in the driving force of the INGOs and who have the responsibility to feed back to the boards, to feed back to the shareholders, and are representative of the organization globally, are able to sit down in a room and say, we want to shift because we see that things are, we cannot expect different results and be doing the same thing. We would move much faster. Because even at then, they won't have all the answers, but they are willing to trust the process and they are also willing to collaborate with others. And I know it can happen, and I'll share a personal experience. When I was new as country director of the Amnesty Office in Nigeria, I was invited to join a senior leadership development program. And in that program, I met other leaders, whether they were program directors or country heads from different organizations. And I understood that this was in response to senior leadership at the INGO level. So the executive directors of Oxfam, Amnesty International, Action Aid, I think we also had Greenpeace and quite a few others who felt that there was a tension between middle level and senior level leaders within the INGOs, and that they felt having leadership coach and having peers across different sectors could improve their capacity within the organization. But it took the leaders, the CEOs of these various INGOs to come together, design a program for their staff and management. So if they could do that because they saw a problem, then they could all, because they were losing their leaders, because people were burnt out, people were, you know, disillusioned, then they can do that also if they know they need to shift. Because right now, INGOs were doing catch up to everything that is happening to us. It's the first time in our history, I think, and I'll defer to those who have been in this for much longer, that everything is being thrown at us and we're not able to focus. So showing strong leadership from the global leaders in the INGO movement would be key to making sure that we can adapt quickly and will be given the resources and the space to think and provide solutions to issues that we are experiencing. I'm experiencing it, you know, but we want to be able to get the support in order to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Osai. Those are very practical steps and some experiences that you've shared. It goes back again to the leadership question of the responsibility of those who have the most power and influence to lead by example. So thank you so much. And I like the optimism when you said it can be done, it has been done, and it can be done even more. So just to read some of the contributions from our colleagues who are in this room. Bonnie says, Osai, thank you for articulating the hard questions and encouraging us to push further. Rebecca says, I agree, Wolfgang. As we get more concrete, we also tend to get more diluted. This is our challenge, as counterintuitive as that image may be. Tosca, and this is to Osai, your comments on what you observed as leader were very enlightening. One aspect you talked about, among others, is how you were sponsored at a certain time. By sponsoring, I mean other leaders advocated for you, including behind closed doors. Could you tell us what kind of sponsoring have been most helpful to you? So maybe you can keep that when we come to the Q&A and the contributions Osai, you can share your feedback to that. Deborah Willick says, exploration of the big questions of roles, mandates, business models, a rethink. What step do others in the chat see for proceeding? So that's a really good question. What should we do when it comes to these issues? Practical steps. Isabella recommended something for us to read. And I think you can click on the link. It's on the New Humanitarian page, and it's on CARE's decolonization journey. And then Nana Afajanu from Waxy says, I've seen how practically some of the members of RINGO and Shift the Power movement who have been part of boards have contributed to progressive change. An important point, though, is that they were at the table to enable that contribution to happen. So that that space must be accessible. So yes, even though we've talked that representation may be some sort of placation, it's the first step into providing an opportunity to make change happen. Yes, so thank you. Keep on with your contributions. There's one from Andrew. He says, as we explore governance reform, we need to understand the potential tensions that must be resolved. Example, greater participation for better decisions versus the need for speed and agility with good enough decisions. That's a really good one, Andrew. Thank you for those insights. So Wolfgang, Osai has shared a couple of practical steps that could be taken, focusing on the ways of working. Our colleagues have also shared in the chat other things that we need to take into consideration, including greater participation and the need for speed. So what are your thoughts on what practically needs to be done? What are some of the things that you've been thinking about based on your experience in terms of reforming the way leadership and governance is evolving in INGOs?
So the space that is required for that discussion is hard to get. I mean, we do have the conversations with the leaders. We work with the CEOs, with the global CEOs, including some of them who've been mentioned in the chats. It's not that the reflections and the ambitions and the understanding is not happening. I think it is more, also you've said that, Osai, how do we make it a priority? How does it become as important as the next funding crisis or the next humanitarian or the next, whatever, homemade scandal? We all have those as well. So I think there's a challenge here that we bring those longer term ambitions higher up in the hierarchy of the urgent and important, right? So I think there's collective effort needed. However, again, let's not forget and also acknowledge progress that has been happening. You see the three areas where I think we should focus on. The first one has not been spoken about in this conversation as much as it's been spoken about elsewhere, which is how do we deal with power? The responsible use of power, the need to shift power where necessary, or where possible, also to abolish power where it's destructive, acknowledging different dimensions of power. There's a lot out there, and I think also I want to just mention, because Tosca is in the room and her colleague Esther, they both helped us conduct a benchmarking study on how power shift is happening amongst our ICSOs, by the way, which will be published in an aggregated form in the next couple of weeks. And there's governance power shift labs, which are also happening, but all of that requires both a collective and the longer term approach. And the power dimension, it almost feels too much talked about, but at the same time, mind you, 10 years ago, at least in the organizations that I've worked with, this was almost a subject everyone wanted to avoid. It was difficult to talk about power 10 years ago. It came up as a threat, as something uncomfortable, as something you want to avoid. So now it's in everybody's conversation. So I think there's really a window here where we can make the necessary progress. So the power would be the first one. The second one, I think also we've heard that mentioned a couple of times over the last few days, is to rediscover the solidarity concept as a binding force between the different parties that are out there. And it's good that there's different parties. And there will always be, unfortunately, rich and poor and more privileged and less. But if we make the solidarity that binding force between diverse actors, I think we get back closer to our original mandates. And then the last one is a bit of appreciation of ongoing processes and using, that's more a tactical approach, amplifying this, even incremental progress, avoiding fragmentation, but making sure that over the appreciation of things that go well, which always have a wonderful kind of dissemination effect, let's also not lose the bigger ambitions. Like I've said, if we want to change the system, we can't just be happy by little steps. Anyway, these would be the three areas I would recommend to focus on. And engaging the leaders, it's happening. We need them. You're right, and I think we have a lot of good ones out there who we need to penetrate a bit more.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. Really great insights there on power. I think acknowledging the different dimensions of power, I think that was very insightful. But beyond that, responsible use of power and how to shift power in which circumstance, in which form, and how that is done. And of course, you also mentioned issues around solidarity, which I think is extremely important. What actually brings us together is what we should be focusing our energies on, and really getting together to respond to the challenges that we are facing. I also think that a lot of us will appreciate the comment about ongoing processes, and that's one difficulty within the sector. We tend to duplicate so many things. We hardly coordinate, and so there's no cohesion. So yes, Ringo, but there are so many other processes that we could come together and get the learnings from all this and work much more effectively together, so that we look at it from a more holistic point of view in terms of influencing the wider sector, avoiding, the little projects, that gets us stuck into this project mode and we lose focus. So I think that was really a very good point and a great challenge to all of us, even those of us who are committing to work to sustain the Ringo initiative and momentum. These are really great inputs. So I think at this time, I would like to open the floor for questions and contributions from colleagues. There are some in the chat from Penny, who she writes, within a frame of so much that needs to change, maybe it's more where is it best to start? Broadening the voices that are listened to and acted upon must be the right place to start. But it's often then that things get stuck in her experience. So how are leaders supported to change in response and held to account by staff, trustees, etc.? To the conclusions from listening to these different voices really matters. Yeah. So, and then she says she totally agrees with Wolfgang. Open discussions of how decisions are really made in organizations are extremely important. And then Janet said, I get the sense that one of the slow movers in pushing practical steps in making some of the necessary changes may be the board at the board level. Is that a true assertion? I think this is something that Wolfgang could also contribute to, and Osai as a response to that. If so, what methods have any of you used to help board members understand some of the operational or structural or governance changes you need to make, or that needs to be made? Thank you for that question, Janet. Maybe we'll take one or two questions if people want to, pick up their hands and actually speak. That would be great. One or two questions, and then we'll go back to Osai and Wolfgang for their responses. Any questions, please, or contributions? I see a lot of smiling faces, so I'm anticipating a flood of questions. Any questions?
Nana, you're on mute. Oh, there we go.
Oh, okay, Nana. Yeah, okay. Then Deborah. Nana, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Wolfgang about the understanding, and should I call it the understanding, but maybe the appreciation of this momentum and change when you deal with the INGO leaders and particularly board members? Do you feel, because sometimes you get the sense from, engaging some people in these spaces, that not everybody is on the same level, and particularly the boards who are a bit removed from, the actual staff who are doing the work. There seems to be some kind of dichotomy there, and not everybody really gets it. So do you see that as well? And are there some things that are being done to help some of these, board members who need to support this process come on board?
Thank you so much, Nana. So Wolfgang, sorry, you may want to share your perspectives on that.
Yes, and I think, sorry, someone in the chat asked a similar question, identifying boards as the slowest movers. And I think the observation is right. Now, Nana, I can't give you a quantified answer, but I would still say at the executive levels, I would say the appreciation and the true understanding, also the willingness to engage, is very high. It's 80% maybe. You might have 20%, the usual kind of resistance or lip service, but I think at the executive level, people know what needs to be done. That doesn't mean they do it, okay? Because there's natural hurdles and there's difficulties and level of priorities. When it comes to board, it becomes really much more difficult because we are dealing with federated or confederated organizations, sometimes network types. And the representatives of governance are dealing with two different challenges. One, they're incredibly spread out. I mean, they're representing many actors and parties and bodies in those organizations, A national chapter, Andrew is on the call, a national chapter of Plan Germany, for instance, might have a completely different interest and accountability understanding than a Plan country office. So bringing all those governance levels together is objectively incredibly difficult. And secondly, unfortunately, many of those governance bodies and boards are really caught in very anachronistic processes and structures. This is the stuff that really needs to be decolonized. It remains from, I mean, you've been there, you've seen this, but sometimes you feel you're in colonial Britain, with the way people speak and make decisions, and it's just not contemporary. In breaking this, I think you need, what do we need? We need patience, we need drivers, we need sponsors, we need people who are willing to engage in breaking some of those systems. We do have a so-called Power Shift Lab, a governance Power Shift Lab that we've started in 2018. And there is good progress, and there's tools that we use to kind of modernize those governance structures, increase the awareness and the willingness to engage. This is the slowest part of the system, I would say. And Nana, you're going to get an invitation, by the way, to experience this for yourself. So stand by for a bit of encounter.
Nice one. That's a good invitation. But I'm really intrigued to know from Osai, from your experience, from where you sit, the second part of Janet's question of, have you had the opportunity to try to help, for lack of a better word, the global board members to really kind of appreciate some of the changes that will help transform, for example, amnesty? And how has that experience been? Have you been successful? What are some of those challenges?
Yeah. Yes, it's a very interesting question. I don't engage with the global board on a regular basis, but we sometimes have forums where they participate. And oftentimes they say, we're just here in listening mode. We're just listening. And so sometimes it's hard for you to pick, what have they successfully, taken from the process and things like that. It hasn't helped that for the last few years, all our meetings have been virtual because of the COVID pandemic. But I do know from the reports we see that there's a tension in the room for those who want change to happen very quickly, especially those that are on the board that are from the global south. So which shows that when you have the right people in the right rooms, there'll be some conversations that will be that whether you like it or not, you can't run away from. But because the bulk of the members are still used to, you know, the way Amnesty works, the good work, and then and I like the point Wolfgang makes. They keep talking about, you know, the progress they've made, how successful they've been, how they've saved so many people. And people are saying, we're not just because we're saying this does not mean we're dismissing the achievements and the successes you've made. But you can see that there's a lot more I won't call it resistance, they are more conservative. Conservative is a better word. And so, like, let's not rock the boat too much. These things are working fine. People are just a bit upset, would apologize and would move on. And we're like, no, you can't put a plaster on this one. This one is a deep wound. You either need to do a surgery or you need to, you know, produce a different arm or leg, if possible, to deal with that particular challenge. So hopefully we'll get to a point where they'll move from listening mode to more like, okay, let's get these actors in, and then we can have a session which is interactive. And perhaps it's also the mood, maybe off the record kinds of conversation, because boards are also scared about litigation. They're also scared about staff rising up to protest and all of that, the reputation of the organization, external forces, you know, coming in and infiltrating. So there's a lot more they are worried about that we don't have to. So perhaps if we could have those conversations off the record or Chatham House rules might help in also, you know, expressing some of the tensions we have. And if you let me, Charles, I can respond to Tosca's question. I'm really happy to see her here. Tosca was one of the trainers in my leadership program, so really proud to see her. And I hope she's also excited about the fact that I'm implementing some of the tips and that they had shared when we participated in the program. In terms of the sponsoring experience that I've had, what I've found that has worked most effective is your sponsor bringing you into these rooms. So when I was in Oxfam, there was a time when there was a huge regional meeting of senior leadership of the different Oxfam affiliates and heads of country programs and regional programs in Africa. And I got the opportunity to participate, even though I was not one of those. And it was because of some work we were doing then at the Pan-Africa program. But what it did for me was that, one, they found the resources to fly me to participate in the meeting. They created a position within the agenda so that I had to present the work I was doing and to get buy-in from the various country directors and regional leads in order to implement that project. What happened was that something that I'd been writing emails for 1 year, I got a lot more done in the few days of those meetings, because it meant somebody believed in it, someone whom they trusted, someone whom they respected, felt this was something they needed to sign up with. And it dramatically changes even the way they approach and the help that is offered. And sometimes managers and leaders don't realize how this can be, you know, a game changer in the way you are perceived and in the risk people are willing to take on you. So that was one. Another time was in pointing out opportunities, sometimes within the organization elsewhere that you might not ordinarily see because you're busy with the operational, you're running around. And then they say, hey, let's have this conversation. I say, well, have you seen this? We're contributing to this. Is this something you're interested in? You know, and then they share you the material. So they're able to see some things, point you in the right direction and encourage you to take it, even when you are not so sure yourself. So those are ways in which I have benefited from having such sponsors. And they don't necessarily have to be your direct managers. just other senior people within the organization whom you've built a rapport with. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Osai. Thank you, Wolfgang. There's an interesting question. I'll coming to Rebecca because I've seen her hand as out. There's an interesting question by Muhammad Awal. Maybe you can think about it and we come back to that. He says, what do you think about the concept of co-leadership, where the South and North co-lead and have access to first point of decision making? Could that be the cure to some of the challenges? It would be good to get perspectives on that. And Andrew Maryan also talked about the role of membership in changing governance and decision making. And so she was talking about how we can increase membership, recognizing that each entity may bring different value to decisions. So Rebecca, I know you have a question. Kindly go, or a contribution.
Charles, I do, but I'm taking it in a slightly different direction, and I wonder whether Awal's question on co-leadership is so directly linked to what you're talking about now. Maybe we stay with that and then I come back in.
Oh, okay. Excellent, excellent. So any thoughts on co-leadership? Wolfgang.
No, happy to. I mean, everything that's innovative might help. And the co-leadership is it's a good idea for many reasons, not just because you have different perspectives in the room, but also you can ensure different qualities. Because mind you, we have leaders in the sector that might be excellent in terms of, representing their organization externally, pushing the advocacy agenda, and might not be so good in, doing internal transformations, and not everyone can do everything. So I think there needs to be acknowledgement that the job that needs to be done cannot be done by one superhuman. I think it can be and must be a collective effort. And whether it's co-leadership like Greenpeace did for a while, and I think the North-South dimension would help, I think is a great idea. And as we're at it, before maybe Osai and Rebecca also speak, the question by Mohammed around voices, diverse voices that the boards need to listen to might be also diluted before they reach them. This is actually one of the biggest challenges, but also one of the most earnest efforts that I'm seeing in the sector. How do you bring the perspectives of the communities and the people you serve into governance decisions? It's a long spread, and sometimes objectively it's very difficult. Like Osai said, you might have to invest in flying people into changing the formats of meetings that might not just be attractive for a person from a community or a young person or even a child or something, to contribute to. There's a lot of experimenting going on, organizations like the World YWCA, for instance, and I think also Plan has invested a lot in bringing voices directly into the board meetings. So I think that's excellent, but maybe that's also one of the biggest challenges. And last point also from the chat, Mareike, you speak about a disincentive, for change. And yes, you're right. I mean, the CEO might only have that much interest in a dramatic change. We've seen CEOs and secretary generals losing their jobs over being too ambitious and just having been told, sorry, you're driving the organization into a direction that a more conservative board doesn't accept. So that is a reality. And I think it's time for us to think about re-incentivizing, transformation and making this as important and relevant as some of the other things, income and reach and the like.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. Osai, any thoughts on the co-leadership?
Oh, yes. And we've seen it from the examples of some of the feminist organizations like Association for Women in Development, AWID. When they muted the co-leadership model that time, people were like, okay, how would this work? And it seems to be working quite fine. It also helps in a way to dismantle some of the power structures we have, because we're used to having a head, then a deputy or vice president. So the idea of having two people leading an organization and bringing their strengths and compensating for their weaknesses was something that was quite novel, but we've seen that can work. It can also help in also reducing executive pressure and burnout. And so it's not so much a benefit for the organization, but also a benefit for the individuals concerned. I think it would be more around how this transition would evolve and how, whether this would be a clean-cut decision-making process, like, oh, you are involved in operational, me, I'm involved in programs, or it's truly a shared one. Because like Wolfgang has noted, and I'm sure all of us realize, there's no perfect person in this role. But just because something is not your strength does not mean you cannot have a say or a contribution to it. So how do you make sure you are able to select the right people who complement each other, are comfortable in each other's spaces? Because it can also go horribly wrong when you have people who can stand each other and they're supposed to be taking decisions concerning the organization. So it means a lot of deliberate attention to who are selected, as well as providing the support. I place a lot of emphasis on support because oftentimes people think, you have everything, get on with it. But it's important that there are other people checking in and looking after these people that are looking after everybody else, so that they are also, caught up from falling into very complicated situations. I will also say that perhaps one way, yes, global, not global south might work, but we must also be open that it might not necessarily be the most effective way, that they also want to participate in the decision making. I've seen people who say, yes, I don't want to run the organization, but I do want to be an advisor, and I do want to be kept abreast of how this is being implemented. So sometimes the most obvious leadership role might not be what certain groups of people also want. So I think we should be open to say, okay, how do you think you can lead or participate or share your skills or your knowledge in this process? And it might be something not necessarily in this hierarchical structure that currently exists, that might appeal to people are more comfortable with. And sometimes it might even mean you moving to their own settings, participating in their own forums, and then you having to then feedback from that process. So I think let's not think only in terms of how organizations are structured, but also the comfortable, most comfortable means that people are then encouraged to share in more empowered ways. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that, Osai and Wolfgang. So Rebecca, please kindly go ahead with your question. I know it's related to boards and decision making, so I'm actually excited, want to hear what the question is about.
Thanks, Charles. And I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. I was really exercised when you said, Wolfgang, about, as we get more concrete, we also dilute. And it's true, and it's a tough one. And, we have had these conversations about maybe, INGOs being able to take the difficult decision, often impossible decision, of choosing to exit, of deciding we've done what we needed to do, we can leave. And I worked briefly with an organization in the UK in the Quaker tradition, and they were a very reflexive organization. And so they did every 5 years really seriously look at, is there a reason to continue? And researched it. And, it was a genuine process. I'm curious, Osai and Wolfgang, whether you're aware of any INGO boards that have gone there with that question, really taken it seriously. And maybe, are you aware of any INGOs that have decided to close? And are there any case studies that we could be following? Because I think we need to create a narrative of what's possible here, what's healthy in a good ending.
So Osai, do you know anyone who's gone there?
I can't help Rebecca here. I don't know of anyone. You just keep hearing people say, no, we're going to be here in 10 years time. Oh, we're still relevant. We're expanding, So sorry, nothing from me.
Yeah, I have a few ideas. I mean, first of all, I think Isabella is just posting a good case study on the chat of the microcredit organization. I can't tell you about an organization that has closed down, but I mean, we've had contexts, country contexts or even regions where organizations had to withdraw. And for instance, Sri Lanka is a pointing case where many aid organizations or social justice organizations were operative and then they couldn't for long. And this was for a number of reasons, partly because the finances were not there, which is the worst reason for exiting. And then there was some organizations who did pretty well because they were intentional, they were proper in building up, partners and supporting the structures that they've built up and handing over. So there's actually quite some good case studies around that, because these are hard decisions in themselves. Maybe closing down an organization is too big of an ask and there's too much rhetoric around this. We don't want to live another 50 years or so. We want to work ourselves out of the job. But I think in many contexts, this is being done. And I think it's worth looking at how it's being done. On Sri Lanka, I know there's a couple of very good case studies. I know Sightsavers documented their exit. I know CARE used a very, very intentional approach of building up a local organization that got its own wings. A Plan had difficulties in the way they exited, and it's been published also by their own on their own website. So there's some case studies of how to do and how not to do.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. I think there's a couple of case studies that are being shared. One was shared by Isabella. Wolfgang made reference to that. And yes, and then she also shared that every child actually closed and wrote about it. Excellent. I would love to read that. And Osai, yes, there's one from the Whitman Institute that was shared by Bonnie. And Osai makes the point that it's about seeing the closure actually as a success. I like that. And then SOS Sahel UK, yes, wrote about their localization journey. But Janet also says, I think it's not so much about closing down as embracing the necessary changes, looking at all angles of organizational changes to become effective in achieving what may be the ultimate success, ending poverty. So that's another very insightful perspective. But, we can't end this really interesting conversation, just like that. So I would like to do a little call to action. Those of us who are here, many of us are on boards, many of us are in places of influence. We can influence policy and direction. So we're going to put up a question through the Mentimeter. Our colleagues from tech, we're going to share that on the, thank you so much, Sarah, for that, and project it. It's a very simple, but not so simple question. So if Sarah could share that. And based on the conversations that we've had today, based on where you find yourself on specific INGO boards or committees, working groups, as country directors, executive directors, what do you plan to do to transform leadership and governance where you find yourself? So like I said, simple, but not so simple, simple question. So what do you plan to do in terms of practically? And we would like to capture that to help us in terms of with our engagement moving forward, especially with boards and leaders of INGOs. So what do you plan to do to transform leadership and governance where you find yourself? Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Very interesting perspective, awareness building of the change in our operating ecosystem and provoking reflection. What that means for the organization. I like that. I like the word provoking. Very good. Keep facilitating the co-creation of systems change, advocating for entrepreneurship. Love that. And managing impact. Challenge the executive from my position on the board to plan practical changes, not just words. That is amazing. And then design a session with our board to convince them to be part of the change we want to see, rather than just the people with oversight. As a trustee, accept the risk of change. If we could scroll down a bit, Sarah. Thank you. Keep pushing for racial equity, always. Keep pushing on reflection on white supremacy culture and how it shows up in all levels. So dismantling the racial structures. Volunteer to be on review or strategy committees. It means creating time to contribute in those spaces and being accessible to the board and management. I know CARE is putting up International is looking at putting up a committee. Bond is also putting up a committee. So that would be great opportunities for those who are interested in this space. Youth participation in governance at local and global levels. Okay, a general reflection on what we need to change with all actors in the organization and move to action. I think that's basically the mantra of this festival. Less talk, more action. Consistent demands for inclusion of minority groups in the highest decision-making bodies of INGOs. Excellent. I think these are excellent calls to action. And I would like to thank our speakers, Osai Ojigo and Wolfgang Jaman, for making time for this conversation, and the insights and the contributions were really rich. And also thank all those who participated in this. It was very active. We made contributions, asked all the difficult questions. And I think there's a high level of commitment to see transformation, but there's also a recognition that we've actually made some progress and an acceptance of that, but recognizing that there's so much more work that needs to be done. So thank you so much for being on this call. So if we could project the upcoming programs, what's next? We're going to have two interesting conversations that I will encourage all of us to join in our next Map for Change at 1:45 UTC. And that is how we can revolutionize accountability and measurement. How can we revolutionize accountability and measurement? That's going to be very interesting. And how do we embed solidarity in everything that we do? Another very interesting session. Unfortunately, it's running concurrently. I wish I could split myself, but I have not found an opportunity to do that. I'm still working on that. Don't know how I'm going to do that, but it's going to be very interesting session. And I'll encourage those of us who are into accountability and measurement should go there. And then of course, solidarity. And of course, they'll all be recorded. So in the end, we'll not miss out on everything. So thank you so much for your participation, and thank you for being part of this process. Thank you and have a lovely day. Bye.
Hi all, I'm gonna close this session.